And a special thanks to our presenters who are joining us from Mali, Arizona, and right here in DC. And also a huge thank you to our ITEP GA graduate assistants, Beck Waghorn, Carmen Wilson, and David Royster, who have supported us behind the scenes. I'm so excited to bring together 3 speakers from our field to discuss the challenges and opportunities that COVID-19 has presented to international education. This evening represent the breadth of comparative and international education, from academia to cross-cultural exchange work to international development. For this evening, I'll introduce the speakers, and they all have PowerPoint slides and presentations that they'll share with you. After that, I'll have some questions for them, and then we'll open up the conversation to questions from the floor. Carmen Wilson, our GA, who is there on the window there, but her camera's not on, will be monitoring the questions in the chat box. Please post questions throughout the panel. Please, please, please don't wait till the end. Carmen will read them out for the panelists. The panelists will also be able to read them, but we want to make sure we hear from all of you. So don't wait, please post those questions. Also, this Zoom session is being recorded, and we should have closed captioning available if needed. So I'm so excited again to welcome all of you. And without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker tonight will be Dr. Heather Macleod, who is the Director of Academic Affairs at NAFSA, Association of International Educators, the world's largest nonprofit association dedicated to international education and exchange. In this role, she manages the association's work with global learning, comprehensive internationalization, and intercultural communication and training. Dr. Macleod oversees global communities of practice focused on international education leadership, as well as teaching, learning, and research to inform practice. She received her BA and MA from Missouri State University and her PhD in educational leadership and policy analysis from the University of Missouri-Columbia. Our next speaker will be Dr. Yudeta Silova, who is a professor and director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Global Education at Arizona State University. Her research examines the intersections of post-socialist, post-colonial, and decolonial perspectives in envisioning education beyond the Western horizon. She is particularly interested in childhood memories, ecofeminism, and environmental sustainability. She served as the editor of European Education, an associate editor of Education Policy Analysis Archives, and is the current president of the Comparative and International Education Society. And last but not least, we have Khoshal Harris-Hussein, who's joining us from Mali, where she is the Education Office Director of USAID Mali. She began her international career as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Republic of Moldova. No coincidence there. That's how Khoshal and I know each other. Followed by working as a country director for American Councils for International Education, overseeing the academic exchange programs. In 2005, Khoshal joined the Foreign Service with USAID, where she focused on education programming in Nigeria, Pakistan, Egypt, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. She has also worked on general development programming of U.S. foreign policy goals across the Middle East, including Jordan, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, and Syria. Khoshal is an MPA from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University and is a former Fulbright Fellow. So welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us. And again, thank you to everyone who is zoomed in. It's really exciting to see many of your names. We have a lot of alumni out there that are joining us from all parts of the world. So without further ado, again, I'll turn it over to Heather.
All right. Hello. Happy International Education Week, everyone. Let me just share my screen. All right. So hopefully everyone can see that and everyone can hear me. My name is Dr. Heather Macleod. I'm with NAFSA, the Association of International Educators, the world's largest nonprofit association dedicated to international education and exchange. We have over 10,000 members at more than 3,500 institutions in over 150 countries. I am the Director of Academic Affairs, where I work to bring the international educators, the professionals in that field to other parts of higher education, especially in professional schools. As Dr. Warden mentioned, I oversee 2 global communities of practice. One is focused on teaching, learning, and scholarship in the field of international education, and the other is focused on international education leadership. So what does the future of international education look like? That is an overarching question for this event this evening. For starters, this is the 21st International Education Week. For those of you who are not familiar with this week, it's a joint initiative of the U.S. Departments of State and Education. International education has a long history in the United States. NAFSA, for example, was founded in 1948, and another kind of sister organization, the Institute for International Education, I believe was founded around the same time. So yesterday, at the start of International Education Week, IIE produced their annual Open Doors reports, and NAFSA published an economic value tool, and data was shared from a consortium called Project Atlas. And I'll be sharing some of this data with you right now, just to give a very quick overview of what has just been released. And I will share the links to the actual reports with you all, because I am not a data expert in the terms of this type of data, and so I encourage you to all go see for yourself. So this is a chart of international students in the United States. They've trended upward. You'll note there's only a small decrease around 2001, 2002 here in the United States. This is the 5th consecutive year that the US has welcomed over 1 million international students to the US. There was a slight decrease in this past academic year, about 1.8%, and I should note that is prior to COVID-19 kind of upending all of our lives. But the US still remains the #1 host of international students. In the 2018-2019 academic year, well over 400,000 US students engaged in education abroad, representing a 1.6% increase. These numbers have steadily increased in all regions, including US students studying in multiple countries. There has been a 19% growth in the number of colleges and universities reporting study abroad students over the past 20 years. So this, like the other slides, represents a very kind of upward trajectory. Again here, study abroad trends. US students studying abroad have trended upwards. There was a slight decrease around 2007, 2008, which was when we had our financial crisis in the United States. So this is a report from NAFSA's economic value tool. A report is an overview from the last decade, dealing with the 2018-2019 academic year. Again, over 1 million international students in the US created and or supported well over 400,000 jobs. Over 1 million international students studying at US colleges and universities contributed over $38 billion to the US economy. And one interesting point is that for every 8 international students, 3 US jobs are created and supported by spending occurring in the higher education, accommodation, dining, retail, transportation, telecommunications, and health insurance sectors. This is some global data from Project Atlas. As with US data, the trends for students studying outside of their home country has continued to steadily increase. In 2018, UNESCO reports that there were 5.6 million international students in the world. And with that, the US represents about 20% of the global total. The US has the largest market share by far, again, 20% of all international students. You'll see the top countries: United States, United Kingdom, Canada, China, Australia, France, Russia, Germany, Japan, Spain are really kind of at the top of this market. These top 5 receiving countries are consolidating their positions at the top of the list. They're hosting more students numerically and percentage-wise each year. These top 5 countries host more than half of all internationally mobile students in the world. The slide highlights the capacity of each of these countries' education system to absorb more international students. Over 1/5 of Australia's, Canada's, and the UK's educational systems already consist of international students, for the United States is just 6%, which means the US still has a lot of room to grow, relatively speaking. This is going to be especially crucial as US demographics are shifting and fewer students of the traditional college age will be attending US colleges and universities. So what's next? Prior to COVID, there were already significant shifts taking place globally in terms of global mobility of students. Non-COVID related trends that were already in motion were demographic shifts, changes in birth, death rates, changes in economic situations, migration patterns. Another trend is increased capacity in countries and or regions, which means that countries, for example, China and India, they have really been doing an impressive job building up their own higher education sectors, which means that students from those countries no longer need to travel outside of their home to study. And the third one is changes in national scholarships. For example, Saudi Arabia used to have a very generous scholarship and funded a very large number of Saudi students studying in the US. That has shifted over the years as it has with other countries. IIE did a fall 2020 snapshot to try to get a look at what's going on with COVID. 99% of responding institutions provided online hybrid options as a result of COVID-19. So the data thus includes those not able to physically be in the US. So these are international students attending US colleges and universities, but doing it solely online, so they are back in their home country. There was a 16% decrease in international students studying at US higher ed institutions in fall 2020. Out of the 90% of the institutions that reported collaboratively noted that around 40,000 students deferred to a future semester. In terms of recruitment of international students, responding institutions reported that 74% have increased their virtual international student recruitment for future semesters, and 64% noted that funding for this recruitment remains the same or higher. There is a lot of cause for optimism despite the doom and gloom that seems to surround us. I should note that COVID is the 12th pandemic in the 101 years of IIE history. So this has happened before. Optimism, historically, when things like this have happened, there's been a strong rebound due to pent-up demand. Study abroad is part of a long-term planning process, which means people start thinking about this sometimes years in advance. So when there's an issue like COVID that comes up, they might defer it to another semester, but they still retain the desire to study abroad. And there's an increase in flexible options for completing education, example, virtual exchange, and then international education represents institutional foreign policy. And that means that these international relationships have been built over decades and won't disappear in 6 months' time. And then finally, pandemics reinforce the need for international collaborative research. All right. So what are challenges and opportunities? We've talked about challenges in terms of opportunities. International educators are some of the most globally competent people in the world. And what I mean by that is that they have the ability to understand complex interconnected issues, work collaboratively across differences to overcome these issues, and are empowered to create change. This global competence has led the international education field to focus on, for example, increased access for underserved populations, increased focus on internationalizing curriculum or changing the narrative from study abroad to study away, meaning that you can study, for example, 12 metro stops away in a very different community than the one you live in, but still kind of in your backyard. And there's been an increased attention to value, what areas of the institution are unique and help fund other aspects of the institution. For example, international student fees traditionally have done some of this work. There's been increased awareness of virtual options. I can't tell you how many times I've heard educators who have been encouraging virtual exchange who said that these exchange programs they've been working on for years and they're not getting off the ground, but with COVID, suddenly the institution is somehow magically open to making this change, which in higher ed is pretty amazing. And then finally, increased awareness of issues related to sustainability, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and social justice. Related to that, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, as you can imagine, COVID impacts everything in terms of education access. When schools are closed, there's a decrease in access. However, the embrace of virtual learning leads to an increase. It impacts poverty, the environment, gender, food insecurity, peace, all of them. This is a quote that I have kind of kept with me on my virtual desk to remind me that this is actually a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity in higher ed to rethink everything. For example, the use of virtual learning and virtual exchange programs. It's a great opportunity really to begin to look at inequitable power structures preventing access and to rethink how we provide access to education. And then finally, relationships with international partners. How can these long-standing relationships be made even better? So COVID-19 leads, of course, to global learning opportunities. It highlights our interconnectedness, intercultural competencies, and global competencies are related to that. Components of global competence, I am using the definition here of the Association of American Colleges and Universities, or AAC&U. Their definition is that global learning is a critical analysis of and an engagement with complex, interdependent global systems and legacies and their implications for people's lives and the Earth's sustainability. Through global learning, students should become informed, open-minded, and responsible people who are attentive to diversity across the spectrum of differences, who seek to understand how their actions affect both local and global communities. And finally, they should be able to address the world's most pressing and enduring issues collaboratively and equitably. The final question is, in what ways or how can international education graduate students prepare for this changing landscape? My recommendation would be to focus on global competencies, developing globally competent and engaged citizens regardless of locale. For example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, they are globally interconnected issues, they're interdisciplinary, they provide project and problem-based learning opportunities. So if you're thinking about international education, think about more this idea of global learning, how we're all interconnected. One of the shifts in IE that we've seen over the past several months has been a renewed focus on internationalization at home and internationalizing the curriculum and making sure that these international partnerships and opportunities and these global learning opportunities are available to students wherever they are. And especially now that people can't travel or have limited travel, it's really shifted the emphasis from the traditional physical mobility to this idea of just embracing global competence at home. And that is my presentation. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you so much, Heather. That's a fantastic way to get us started. And I so appreciate you brought in the open doors data. And I forgot to tell the audience that I had asked the panelists a series of questions to answer. What does the present and future of international education look like with COVID-19? What are the challenges and opportunities? And last, how can graduate students and also undergraduate students prepare for a future career in international education? So we will now move to Yudeta, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much. Well, and first of all, many thanks for joining us today. Happy International Week to everyone. And I will talk today on my very, very personal experience of being affected by COVID-19 as a president of Comparative and International Education Society, in charge of organizing a conference for more than 4,000 people who plan to come to Miami, Florida for a 4-day conference last spring. And at the very last minute, 3 weeks before the conference, it was canceled and we had to completely rethink everything. So I'll share that experience with you today and what we can learn from it and what I personally have learned from this experience. Next slide, please. So for about 1.5 years leading up to the conference, I have been working with an amazing team of colleagues and students and friends to actively prepare for the conference. The theme of the conference was education beyond the human, and the goal was to radically reimagine the role of education in the context of human-induced climate crisis. And this theme offered an opportunity for us to propose several provocations for our society. First, we argued that humans have become the dominant force behind the irreversible ecological catastrophe, and the ideas of human exceptionalism and neoliberal individualism, the core concepts of Western philosophy and foundations of modern political economy, and actually the underlying assumptions of modern education system. So these concepts really can no longer serve as a single vision for surviving on a damaged Earth. The second provocation was that education is directly implicated in the climate crisis. And so we use such examples as the world today is the most educated it has ever been, yet also closest to the environmental collapse. So this means basically that more of the same education will not really help us survive the climate crisis. So we need to radically reconfigure the core purposes of education. And also to rethink who we are ourselves. And as a third provocation, basically rethink us as a professional organization, but also individually as academics, as educators, as members of the CIES, and an invitation basically to our colleagues to rethink our own research priorities, especially our current preoccupations with global education trends, whether it's student achievement tests or competitive education league tables or global ranking exercises or best practices, and put our research agendas into much broader planetary and more than human perspective. So basically, in short, the conference theme was the provocations that we need to urgently redefine what it means to be human and reconfigure the relationship between human and Earth and the role of education in this process. Next slide, please. So we had planned this really exciting program for the conference in Miami, which was supposed to take place in the spring, very carefully locating the CIS within the local community in Florida. And this program, as part of the program, we actually also plan to extend the conference into the virtual space in an attempt to reduce our carbon footprint and address inequities related to international travel. Basically, we tried to model not only the theme, basically tried to bring the theme not only up for the discussion among the society, but also model it in practice. And we put a lot of creative energy into curating the program in such a way that every single person who would come to the conference, no matter how interested or engaged they were with the conference theme, no matter whether they wanted to join personally or in person or virtually, that they would be touched by the conference theme in one way or another through either intellectual engagement or through visual and experimental aspects of the program, through the art program, or simply through the spatial awareness. And next slide. And then, actually, it has to be the slide before, sorry. And then the COVID-19 hit very abruptly, disrupted all of our plans, requiring us to cancel the on-site of the portion of the conference and shift into the virtual space in a matter of weeks. And despite all of the challenges associated with the COVID-19 response, I believe that actually the goals of the conference have been already achieved by canceling the conference, even without traveling to the conference site. So in very ironic way, But in a very powerful way, the very idea of the human exceptionalism has been dramatically challenged, not by us and our efforts as conference organizers to engage the society in this discussion, but actually by a virus. So, we ended up with the fact that every single CIS member, whether they were willing to engage with the conference theme or not, they have been very directly and personally affected by it. And I think it definitely underscored the urgency of the conference theme, but also triggered a very alarming realization that the future is already here, and it is happening now. And we really cannot afford any small incremental steps anymore. And we need to change our ways of being now. So I'll focus a little bit focus on the transition to the online space that this COVID-19 pandemic required. And as I have mentioned, the conference, so the cancellation of the conference itself basically delivered the theme of the conference very loud and clear on its own. So actually we could have left it at that, I think, and I would have been happy as a society president. But we were in a really very, very dire financial situation as a society. So we faced very high penalties from the corporate hotels with which we had contracts, and which actually initially refused to waive penalties for the cancellation. If we paid the penalties and refunded everybody who already paid their registration, we basically would bankrupt the society, and we could not afford that either. So our only option was to keep the registration fee and refund only those who were affected the most, and that was students and members from low-income countries, and invite everybody else into the virtual space, meaning that we needed to shift the entire program of 4,000 plus people into the virtual space in a matter of 3 weeks. And here again, the theme of the conference was very serendipitous. From the very beginning, to fully engage with the theme, we planned a very small virtual conference pilot. And our idea was to create a very carefully curated and well-prepared virtual space to demonstrate to our skeptical colleagues that it is possible to engage in virtual or hybrid conferencing in meaningful ways. So our approach was based on 3 assumptions. First, we took a decolonial political stance and try to think about how can we engage the colleagues who either refuse to come to the US for political reasons, and we have many colleagues like that, or who can not afford to travel to the US because either of funding restrictions or visa restrictions. Then our second assumptions was to take a climate conscious approach, and again, think about how can we create structures that help engage colleagues that refuse or choose not to travel for environmental reasons. And there is a growing number of colleagues in this category. And this basically began the foundation, the way or the reasoning behind building the foundations for hybrid or on-site engagement as a pilot. So we definitely did not foresee that the pilot would need to be expanded so extensively and so quickly, but we did have some foundations built already. So we continued with that. So now we can go to the next slide. So, but this task was really not easy. We worked as a group of volunteers without much technical support. The turnaround was so fast that the only way we could possibly conceive doing it was by relying on a very decentralized and organic self-organizing approach. Basically, having a living calendar that was curated and assembled by people themselves. And this was our way to help reduce the pressure to participate for those who were overwhelmed with the COVID-19 related disruptions at home or at work, while keeping the space open for the intellectual exchange and connection for those people who needed such connection at that very difficult time. So we had the living calendar that was basically allowed people to schedule and reschedule their own presentations, which had lots of challenges, but also some really interesting opportunities. So we'll go to the next slide now. Despite the numerous challenges, including Zoom bombing and others, the outcome of this impromptu transition into the virtual space was a very vibrant, although much smaller in scope conference program that extended in time to a month and a half. So about 2/3 of the original program made it into the virtual space in one form or another. So we had a film festival, which was fully transitioned in the online space, a participatory art program, keynotes, parallel sessions, posters, pre-conference workshops, book launches, and we had synchronous and asynchronous programming to also adjust for the time differences of the CIS members. And we hosted SIG business meetings, virtual coffee breaks, and even some virtual mentoring and networking, and even a virtual Mexican party. So we learned many, next slide, please. So we learned very many lessons from this experience, but I will only share a couple. So first and foremost, we learned that doing more research or organizing more conferences to discuss the issue of climate crisis or the role of education in it is really no longer an option. We are already too late. We should have started decades ago. And at this point, we need to realize that the future is already here. It is already now, and we have to act now. So it was a really, to me, a fascinating time to realize that the discussions that we as a conference organizing committee were planning to unfold at the conference, it was almost already too late. We had to act, not just talk about this. Then the next slide, please. Another lesson is that it is possible to think, to change things in radically different ways. And we cannot simply dismiss alternative ways of organizing as a professional society any longer, or mobilize alternative ways of mobilizing and sharing knowledge just because it has never done before. And because we may miss face-to-face interaction. I think the stakes are way too high. And as a professional association, our conferences bring together thousands of people from across the world for less than a week. It's a very high price to pay in the time of climate crisis, or the COVID pandemic for that matter. Next slide, please. So another lesson is that we can radically reduce our carbon footprint as a society, and this experience demonstrated it. The cancellation of the conference alone saved about 100,000 trees from being cut, almost 500,000 gas from being used, and over 4.5 million pounds of coal being burned. So why wouldn't we want to consider reducing our carbon footprint in the so-called normal times? The next slide, please. So although not all of the program made it into the virtual space, we actually engaged more people than ever before. Normally CIS conference brings together about 4,000 people, with many presentations being pretty empty, sometimes just a few people in the room. This time our conference website was accessed by almost 64,000 people from 200 countries in the world. Mostly, of course, from the US, but also from Japan, Pakistan, China, Brazil, and more. And just for some more statistics, our Twitter account gained 500 new followers just in a matter of 1 week. So next slide, please. But ultimately, the biggest lesson to me personally is that we pretty much are too late to the game already. We cannot continue to pretend that there will be some miraculous techno fix and that we will be able to go back to normal. I think what COVID-19 taught us is that the pre-COVID-19 time was not normal at all, that it's possible to do things differently, but in short, that we do need to act now. And so for me personally, and hopefully for the CIS, the lesson is that it's a really amazing opportunity to build on this disruption of the status quo of the conference genre as such that the COVID-19 created. It's an opportunity to seriously rethink the role of the roles that mobility plays in knowledge production, and how we can try to shift thinking about this. And it's also an opportunity to think about new ways of conferencing, whether in virtual or hybrid ways, that is not a substitute, but is a real alternative. And perhaps the first question to start with is rethinking, what do we value the most in our face-to-face interaction at the conferences, and how can we recreate these experiences in other ways and in other spaces to ensure that they are as meaningful and at the same time that they are more sustainable to what they have been so far. So I will stop here and look forward to some discussion afterwards.
Great, thank you so much. Did you have one last slide that had the,
Oh yeah,
yeah, one last slide?
you can click it one more time. So that was our conference. Basically the CIS turned into the virtual CIS. So we became known at the time by VCIS, which will be the same again this year. I'm sure that you all have heard the announcement already.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Yudeta. I have lots of questions about your thoughts, and also am inspired by the Act Now and thinking about what's possible. So I will save those questions until after Crochelle presents. So Crochelle, it is all yours. Beck will start your slides for you.
And you can hear me, right?
Yes, loud and clear from Molly.
Okay, perfect. Because yes, I am in a place with every now and then there are a little bit of challenges. So I don't want IT tonight to be one of them. So hi, everyone. I also want to say happy International Education Week. I think my presentation might be a little bit different from the others. I think, you know, we all have our different way of looking at what's happened with COVID-19. But I also should say that I'm not presenting on behalf of USAID, but I do work for USAID, which is known as the U.S. Agency for International Development. For those of you that might not know exactly what USAID is, it's a department of the U.S. government that really is using the taxpayers' money for an assistance in developing countries, so that we are trying to help shape public policy, strategic direction, and improve the general safety and well-being of populations in our partner countries. So USAID is not typically thought of, or it's not the first agency that comes to mind when you think about international education, but our development programming really looks at governance, economic growth, health, education, and humanitarian assistance. So all of those things kind of come together. For today's discussion, let's move to the next slide. I thought what I would do is kind of use Mali as a case study. So I'll talk a little bit about maybe a brief overview or some background of the country. Then I'll go into what I think is really important for you to understand in this case, and that's the conditions that existed prior to COVID-19, because they really do inform what we are trying to do post-COVID-19. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to the overarching US government support here, and then address some of the questions that Lizzie mentioned that she wanted us to talk about. So next slide. So just to give you a little bit of background on Mali as a country, it is a Francophone country because it was a former French colony. It is the 8th largest country in Africa. It's located in West Africa, and it's located in the Sahel, which is a pretty critical region at this point in time, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It's a population of about 19 million, but well over 60% of the population is under the age of 25. So it's a very large number of young people. So education and education development here is really, really important to the future of the country. The education system looks a little bit like it does in other Western countries. As you can see there, there's pre-primary, there's a good solid block of what we in USAID consider and other development partners consider to be primary education. So they had initially had 6 years, like grades 1 to 6 and then 7 to 9, but all of that has become a complete block, grades 1 to 9 being what's considered primary education. And then there are 3 years that are catering towards secondary or high school level. So next slide. Now, here's where we really get into the crux of what's going on and what the US government is trying to address here with the government of Mali. So there were really a lot of challenges to the education system that existed even before COVID-19 came in. And I won't go into a lot of depth here, but I want to just run down the list. So there's rapid population growth, as I mentioned. Well over half of the population is under the age of 25. That coupled with weak governance and lack of provision. And so what that means is social services like health and education are not provided to the standard that's needed for economic development and growth of the country. And it's not provided widespread enough. So you have poor quality and you have lack of access. Also, as I mentioned, the country is located just below the North Africa region. So it's in the Sahel, which is facing a lot of insecurity and conflict. I'm sure everybody's heard about jihadist group movements in this region. Not only do you have the terror, sort of war on terrorism, if you will, but you also have intercommunal fighting as well. And that goes back to a little bit of what Yudeta was kind of touching on. As we see climate change occur, you're having a lack of resources. And as you deplete resources like water, grazing land, arable land, then you run into the struggle over resources, and that creates conflict within communities. School closures and disruptions to learning, and keep your eye on that one. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Climate change, and here I'm going to highlight it a little differently because climate change is also causing flooding here. When you have flooding, it closes schools. Also, climate change causes droughts and things that disrupt the agricultural season. That also causes issues with school and education. You, as we probably have heard, have waning support from the donor community. With so many competing needs across the world, across countries, donors are really experiencing fatigue in competing priorities with where they support and how they support. And now with COVID-19 and so many countries having to turn inwardly to figure out how to overcome the economic crisis that they're witnessing, I feel like we're going to see more and more of a strain on resources for international development. Unforeseen crises, again, that's a COVID-19 related kind of thing I'm going to come to in just a second. And then finally, you have here cultural and religious expectations. In a country like Mali, religious education is seen as much more valuable than secular education. And so what that means is a large percentage of children are being educated in a way that doesn't actually prepare them to be economic contributors or to contribute to the economic growth in their countries, and that causes a problem as well. So all of these things together compound school closures and unforeseen crises like COVID-19. We already had teacher strikes. Teachers had been striking here, and that's a governance issue. So teacher strikes had caused public schools to close across the country. Conflict had already closed over 1,000 schools around the country. So with those two things already happening, with the few schools that remained open, then COVID came along and closed them. So there was no education happening in the country at all. And we're looking at possibly like at least a year's setback in the education system here. Any gains that we had seen, especially through USAID's work and any of the donor work that was going on here, will be tremendously impacted. So for instance, we had finally gotten the wheels moving on girls' enrollment. And now we just don't know what's going to happen with that. Particularly, as you know, across the world, with school closures and girls not being in school, you either will have increases in early marriage among girls in developing countries, or girls are sent off to do livelihoods and bring in income to support the families, as families have seen their overall income decrease. And we have a sense that even as schools reopen, those girls may not return to school. So it's like, in some ways, we're starting the battle all over again, especially in poor countries like Mali. So next slide. In the interest of time, I won't dive into this too much, but essentially wherever the US government is working, they do have a strategic focus on what they want to do in that partner country. So we have the high level goals for Mali that really deal with, counterterrorism, promoting trade, building stability, because those are the things that we feel like will help the country succeed and overcome some of its challenges. Looking at working in governance, security is a really vital factor in what needs to happen here, and just encouraging economic growth, opportunity, and development. Education's role in that, and how we see our own manageable interests, really has to do with how we teach children reading as a measure of quality, because you feel if a child can learn to read, he can almost self-educate if they come to a certain level where they don't have access to publicly provided learning. But we also want to ensure that government and governance are critical factors as well, because in most countries, that's the overall provider of education, is the government. And it should be free and it should be available. Let's see. And so what we saw with COVID-19 is that even with the US government strategy here, the agency overall had to kind of pivot and decide how we would address challenges that came about because of COVID-19 in the countries where we work. So USAID had to get together with our government partners, with contractors, other agencies like UNICEF, World Bank, Global Partnership for Education, and come up with both short-term responses and longer-term recovery plans. Those plans included reopening plans. How do you reopen schools? How do you modify existing academic approaches? How do you prepare learning spaces for children to come back? All of that was going on, while we also had to think about the staff of USAID, because large numbers of staff actually had to relocate from the countries where they were working, namely American staff, who relocated back to the United States and worked remotely, along with our local staff in our offices that had to shift to working remotely as well. Next slide. So getting to the questions really that you posed, Lizzie, now we're at a pivotal point where we look at kind of COVID-19 and beyond. And so I want to kind of meld that a little bit with the, trying to provide some answers to the questions of kind of what's next. I talked about the challenges that we saw, but also I want to think about opportunities as well. So some of the opportunities have to do with how we might be able to look at new approaches like distance learning. How can that be modified? Distance learning is a real challenge in a place like Mali, because if you think of technology, well, technology just isn't so strong here. Children can't just essentially take home a laptop, open it up and use Wi-Fi. It's just not a possibility here. So what are some other creative approaches that we maybe used in the past, like radio instruction? How can we bring that back and have that as a useful tool? And then what are other ways we might use this as an opportunity to refocus on the most marginalized, like girls and children with learning disabilities? Especially children with disabilities had become a larger focus of our work most recently, and we really don't want to let any of that slip. But kind of 3 takeaways as well with these questions. So when I think about challenges and opportunities that COVID presents and how that might be looked at from the point of view of international education students, keep in mind that if you're looking at working in developing countries, the countries themselves can be very different from each other. So I find that sometimes we kind of lump them all in together, and that can be more of a challenge to the way that we do programming and for the countries themselves. But sometimes the challenges are quite similar across regions. Where girls are not going to school, that's going to have the same detrimental effect for the country's future. And that looks very similar. What does the future look like? I think it really depends on the context. It depends on the resources available in the country. It depends on the political will and what their priorities might be. And then in what ways can international education graduate students prepare? So it really depends on where you see yourself. I think when I was a master's student, or even before when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I had to really think, where is it that I want to work in the future? Do I want to be in the United States focused on international students coming to America, or do I see myself working abroad? And then also I would say, and I think that maybe Heather got at this a little bit as well, is the world is really changing rapidly. And so it really depends on thinking outside the box, coming up with creative tools for managing situations, and always making sure that you're prepared for shifts and changes, and maybe bringing into your education a bit of things that are not solely education focused. Public policy, financial management, things that make your expertise a little bit broader. I think those added skills really become helpful when you have unexpected changes like COVID-19. So I will, last slide, and then I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Crochelle. And you ended on such a nice practical note. I know master's students, graduate students, and undergrads always appreciate hearing how they can add more skills, some practical things that they can take away with them as they leave the university. So Beck, if you can, oh great, stop the screen share. I have a couple questions for all of you. I will read those. You can think about them and answer, and then we have at least one question in the Q&A, but maybe while I'm asking my question, I will inspire our audience members for more questions. So Heather, I noticed that the dip in student mobility with the US happened prior to COVID. So I was wondering, how much is this linked to the Trump administration? And do you think that it's possible to reverse some of this damage with the new administration coming in? I mean damage in the sense of us, perhaps the United States, perhaps seeming unwelcoming to international students, or for students from the United States going abroad. So whatever you're comfortable sharing about the relationship between student mobility and the current administration and the future administration, I would love to hear. And for Yudeta, I so greatly appreciated your personal take on the conference, because my last CIS conference, I was going to go to Miami, was Mexico City, which I loved, and I brought my whole family to Mexico City, but I was so struck by all the water bottles in Mexico City. No one could drink the water. So after every panel discussion, there were just these bins overflowing with water bottles. And I was so upset about that. And it really speaks to, I think, how many of us were bothered by the carbon footprint that these conferences create. So I'm wondering for you, if you can answer it, what does 2022 look like? Would it be something where there's a larger global virtual component and smaller regional conferences? But I'm also very much interested, and I don't even know if this is a question so much as a comment, in what is the resistance to alternatives to our traditional conference model? And I'm thinking about my students and I talk a lot about decolonization and control of knowledge, right? And is there perhaps privilege and gatekeeping involved, where those who want to maintain this traditional conference model don't want to let it go because it somehow, allows them to gatekeep and allows sort of a less democratic and inclusive conference? So any thoughts on that? I'd love to hear. And then Crochelle, I am so interested. You're laughing, but what's your daily life like? Crochelle and I were Peace Corps volunteers, and our orientation to places is through that lens of being in a community, working with stakeholders. And with COVID, you arrived, I know Molly is a new post for you, but are you able to visit schools? Can you meet with stakeholders? What is it like being on the ground during a pandemic. Any thoughts you have on that? So Heather, we'll start with you, and then I see some more questions coming in, so that's great news.
Right, well, great question. And yes, the Trump administration has had quite an effect on international students seeking to come to the United States. It has been something that NAFSA has been working with our members to address since day one of the Trump administration, if not actually much before that. So there was a hashtag, "You are welcome here," that was created and disseminated and took off like wildfire. And as a result of that hashtag, around that, NAFSA has now built a scholarship program. So NAFSA is doing a lot of work with our members to try to change the narrative of what international students or potential international students hear. I do think that there is concern that the damage the Trump administration has done in terms of messaging will take a while to overcome. But I think that there are so many passionate educators, both international in the US educators who are not international, just in the US, who are so passionate and so eager to kind of help the United States, help our communities to become more globally integrated, not globalization in the negative way, but really focusing on the positive aspects of globalization. So for example, collaborative research to find a vaccine for COVID, and really focusing on those narratives. But it will take all of us working a lot to make that happen.
Great. Thanks so much, Heather. Great answer. Yudeta?
Thanks for the question. And and also, it's in a way an invitation to everybody to think with us about the future of conferencing. Actually, next week we have a town hall scheduled that is an open town hall on the future of conferencing for the CIS members, but it's actually open beyond the CIS as well. And I'm trying to locate the exact date for it, but I will, I will type it maybe in the chat with an invitation to everybody else. But there is a lot of resistance, believe it or not. And partially, I think a lot of the resistance comes down to tradition. You know, we are so used to doing things in particular ways, even if they exclude a lot of people. And even if we are very consciously aware of these exclusions. So, you know, this, to me, first and foremost, it's actually building a culture where we can think about things in radically different ways and, you know, really think how we as an organization can connect to our members that are all over the world, right? And they are making very conscious choices, just like you, Elizabeth, not to come to the conference, right? For particular reasons. I cannot tell you how many colleagues I have who stopped coming to the conference after President Trump was elected because they basically decided, you know, to boycott travel to the United States, including Canadian colleagues and European colleagues. The actually, you know, how many colleagues were affected by the Muslim travel ban, right? And even probably bigger numbers of colleagues choosing not to travel because of the carbon footprint, right? So all of this is kind of culminating and growing, and I don't think we really cannot just ignore all of these issues anymore. So we are trying to mobilize a discussion within the CIS around this issue, and in fact created an ad hoc committee on more sustainable and equal conferencing. And so the town hall, I just actually got a little message from my colleagues. So the town hall is on November 24th at 1 EST. And I can send you the link invitation to that as well. But so there, we do have a lot of, again, provocations that we lined up to, you know, really allow us to face this issue and try to really think carefully how we as an organization can respond. But another hesitation, really quickly, I will tell you is, you know, colleagues, for example, saying, oh, but we can't do anything now because we have a 5-year contract with Hyatt hotels. And so at least for 5 years, we should be doing what we are doing. But again, the experience last year, this year and in 2021 says that we can do things differently, even if we are changed to these contracts to corporate hotels, right? We can renegotiate the contract. We can begin building the culture of more equal conferencing, right? And more sustainable conferencing. We can begin building the infrastructure for virtual conferencing, for regional gatherings, right? For those who cannot come. So we have all of these options on the table right now and trying to gather ideas and people to help us think through all of the possible alternatives. But I just don't think we can go back to normal the way it was. And I don't think it should really be, right now, it's a president-elect who organizes the conference has the power to decide what shape the conference will take. And I don't think it should be in the hands of one person. It probably should be, an organization-wide policy about how we, as a professional, an academic society, want to position ourselves in this very fragile world.
Great, thank you. That's so exciting. I want to be part of the town hall. I made a note of it. It's great. All right, Crochelle, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience.
Okay, so that is kind of a funny question, but thank you for that question, Lizzie. So about daily life now. I had spent the last year or so in French language training. So when I finished French at the end of June, right by July 5th, I started supporting the mission virtually because no one was going to the office anyway. So I was in Washington and I still just sat at the same desk that I was at the week before and worked virtually. Then when I got here, October 4th, I had to go into 14-day stay at home. Now, Molly doesn't enforce a quarantine, so we weren't really calling it quarantine, but basically I spent 14 days at home, again, supporting the work virtually. But now I go into the office 2 or 3 days a week. It's like a ghost town in the USAID section of the compound because people are working virtually. But also I'm kind of liking the couple of days a week from home as well, because I just feel like it's a little bit more relaxed. And, but I went out today to meet with a partner for the first time, and it is strange. I've been in the country for, nearly 6 weeks now, and I'm only for the first time implementing partners face to face, and they didn't have anybody really in their office. Mali is in a weird place right now because there was a shift in government, as we're calling it, back in August. So there was a new Minister of Education. The ambassador and I went to meet with him about 3 weeks ago. We did that in person. Everybody wore masks. There was a little bit of social distance. So, you're trying to incorporate the way things are supposed to be now, and you can't, we have these education cluster meetings and everything's just virtual and everybody's just kind of rolling with the punches. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Crochelle. So I'll turn it over to our fantastic grad assistant, Carmen, who has been looking at the questions. And Carmen, do you want to start them off? And I think the panelists, you should have access to the Q&A as well. You can read the questions, but Carmen will facilitate that.
Yes, thank you. We have some fantastic questions rolling in. I'm going to start with this one that's addressed to all the panelists. A distance learning professional wants to know, how do you anticipate the field adapting to distance or online education moving forward? We can start with Heather, if you'd like to start, or anyone who kind of has a knee-jerk reaction, something to get us started. You can feel free to unmute yourself and answer the question here.
Well, for one, I have seen, and I'm sure you all have seen, just a preponderance of trainings focused now on how to do virtual learning and virtual engagement. And there have been educators who have been fans of virtual engagement and virtual learning for many, many, many years. And their time now has come. And I think across higher education in the United States and other parts of the world, there's this finally a recognition that this is a valid venue for education. It's legitimate. It is something that does offer value. And so I think it's just, there has been a societal-wide embrace of the potential for virtual learning. Obviously, this potential is not always reached. And there are many, many issues, especially in regards to access and technology. But I think there has, in the higher ed sector, at least in the United States, been kind of a paradigm shift to acceptance.
I agree. I think there is a great potential for the online distance learning as well, but I think we have to be very also aware of the inequities that it can reproduce and actually produce also new types of inequities. So I think that has to be on our minds all the time as we think about the virtual learning. And but I think there are tremendous opportunities as well. But again, I also hope that it's not just, one solutions that we are exploring, but that, that we are looking at all other alternatives that may exist in parallel, maybe in addition to, in combination with open and distance learning. But I think there are obviously great potentials.
Yeah, I second that, Yudeta. One thing I will encourage people to think about, though, with distance learning is that the definition needs to be very broad, because I think we in the United States and Western countries tend to immediately go to high tech, and we talk about online and those kinds of things. But in countries that are much more challenged and don't have that kind of capacity, we need to include in that definition very low technology. Low level, I don't want that to sound like a negative description, but things like using radio, because if radio broadcasts can reach a high number of people, and radio broadcasting is something that's already happening, then lessons that can be done for a couple of hours a day, maybe a little bit in the morning, a little bit in the evening, that continue children's education across radio, or education for any levels across radio or television. Those things need to be considered as well. So I just encourage everyone to use a wider definition of the tools that we can use for distance learning.
Great. Carmen, what else do we have in the Q&A there? Thank you all. Those are all really thoughtful answers about distance learning. I did not mean to cut anyone off.
Well, actually, Crochelle's answer kind of ties in with another question here, so I'll go ahead and introduce it. Someone wants to know, have you or others seen the creative community or educators continue to enhance children or youth learning programs during the pandemic while schools are closed?
So, we had, as an agency, USA Today, we had a little bit of an internal discussion today looking at the resources that the agency at the headquarters level has tried to pull together for us to use at the country level in helping governments think through reopening of schools. I think in the case of Mali, thinking about addressing COVID-19 is somewhere sort of near the bottom of the list, unfortunately. There's so many challenges here that the country is dealing with, that if we didn't already have creative solutions to how do you help nomadic populations, how do you help internally displaced children who are moving from one conflict zone to another? How do you help children continue education while their teachers are on strike? They're already facing lots of challenges here. So every day we're trying to come up with solutions. But I would say the key thing that really we have to address is governance. Really, at the end of the day, where does the government of any host developing country place the importance of education on their agenda? And this goes back to the sustainable development goals that you mentioned, Heather. The things are there, all the policies are there, the discussions are happening. It's just, how do we get the implementation? How do we get the policy enacted? How do we drive things, both will and financing, to really ensure that education is equitable, that it's accessible, and that it really is going to help these countries move forward. I'll leave it at that.
Good, thanks, Rochelle. Carmen, I think I saw a question for Heather and Yudeta in the Q&A as well. We can spread the questions out.
Of course, there's so many good ones.
I know,
So
there's a lot of good ones.
there's so many great ones here.
And also, some of us are able to type answers really quickly. So if you posted a question, take a look. I answered Ashley's question about ITAP. Ashley, it's nice to see your name pop up. But Carmen, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so this is a question for Heather. To what extent do we see U.S. and other country students who participate in exchange programs developing more of a global perspective, focusing on working with international organizations and addressing global crises?
I think that there is a shift towards this. There have always been people, there have always been programs whose focus has been on dealing with global crises, ecological, health, poverty, etc. That's been there. It's been a core part of international education and exchange. But I think as a field, international educators, especially in the United States, are really beginning to embrace more of kind of what the Sustainable Development Goals promise. I will say that the United States has been kind of absent from discussions around the Sustainable Development Goals, which has been unfortunate. I think there are many educators in the country who have thought, oh, well, these goals are for other countries, not for America. But I think there is, COVID has really forced the discussion, but even before COVID, educators were like across the board have been thinking about how can we bring these global issues into our classrooms? How can we make it so that if there's, say, 2% of the students who go abroad, how do we engage the 98% with these global issues? And I think that's where the promise of this concept of global learning and global competencies comes in. And in my time with NAFSA, it's been a long time, I have seen many great conversations happening, many great programs happening. I'm focused on bringing these global issues into curriculum so that all students become engaged with these very important topics. So I think there is a shift towards more embrace of that.
Great, thanks, Heather. Carmen?
This question is for Yudeta. Do you plan to utilize some of the data around increased participation and access to your 2020 virtual conference to market your 2021 virtual conference and set the stage for virtual conferences becoming the norm moving forward? And how do you plan to plant the seeds to disruption to the status quo of the conference genre among past and future participants who may view virtual as necessary but temporary solution to conference delivery in the time of COVID-19?
That's a great question. And thank you, Kiri, for it. And I really hope you can join the town hall on the 24th of November as well. So I think it's, both the CIS members, that need to be engaged into this discussion, but also as much the CIS board and kind of the governance apparatus of the CIS as well, who is making decisions currently. And probably a discussion that has to be happening both, top down and grounds up, to really make a difference. And how we advertise the 2021 conference is not entirely up to me, but I, obviously I'm sharing my suggestions with the Karen Monkman, who is the president-elect and who is organizing this conference. And so I hope that that's something that CIS will consider in advertising the conference, because I think it means a lot to many of our members. But there is so much work to be done, and so many. I think maybe the first, we're actually thinking very actively right now how to engage people, right? And so one of our strategies actually right now is also to collect very personal stories to appeal to the board members, but also to appeal to the larger CIS constituency that highlights all the different reasons for why people are hesitant to come to the conference or to continue as business as usual, and really try to bring the stories and experiences to the surface, and bring them into the conversation, and push it on the policy agenda for the CIS. So my personal goal is to actually, before my term ends, is to have some kind of policy on more equitable and more sustainable conferencing. And but it's so difficult to do because you are a CIS president only for a year, and next year I will be the past CIS president, right? And within a year you can only do so much. And with a fundamental issue such as climate crisis, you can't do much in a year. But at least maybe we can put some things in motion and hopefully others will pick them up afterwards. And we have a great colleagues who are behind me, who hopefully will pick it up and institutionalize at least some aspects of this thinking before it is too late, and before we lose too many members to all of these different crises that we are facing. And there will be only more as we continue to live on this planet.
Great. Thank you, Yudeta. And Carrie, thank you for that question. It's so nice to see your name. Carrie is one of our alum who lives in DC, and you should be part of the planning, Carrie. And Heather, also for NAFSA, you have enormous conferences as well. So I'm sure NAFSA is also going to have to address these issues. I know you draw largely from North America, but
we had a similar experience this past summer. Fortunately for us, we had a little bit more of a lead time because our conference is at the end of May. So we had slightly more time to adjust our planning, and we dealt with the issues around the contracts with the Hiltons and the conference convention center and all of that. And so as a result, we put together a virtual conference of sorts that took kind of the highlights and just some very targeted sessions and speakers that were scheduled to be held at the conference. And we brought them online, and we had, as you experience, large numbers of engagement, especially with international participants, which was great to see. And we are planning to have our conference this coming year in Florida, planning for it to be face-to-face, but acknowledging that hybrid, that is part of our discussions. And we also do recognize that it's quite possible we will have to just do a virtual conference again. But I think one of the great things, as you pointed out, is that there has now been this acceptance that virtual conferences can have meaningful interactions, networking opportunities. For this International Education Week, we decided to do a whole other series of virtual events called Campus Connection. And it's just a week-long series of online events for people to network around the world and hear great content. And we had a session earlier today focused on social justice and international education. And it's really opened doors for us and our members in terms of opportunity.
Great. Thanks so much, Heather. We should share those links out with everyone. And I think we have time for one more question. Carmen, is there one question left?
Yes, we have one more question for Crochelle. I'm curious to hear how USAID is thinking about connections and intersections with other sectors, the education sector, and responses to COVID-19. From my own experience, I work on the contracting side with USAID on land rights issues, and we're trying to align our programming with other sectors impacted by COVID, like food security, climate change, etc. Is USAID thinking about this and other connections between education and responses to COVID as well? If so, could you share examples?
Yes, Rebecca. So I was busily typing the response to Rebecca's question as you guys were talking. So I haven't hit the send button, so I'm just going to read what I wrote. So yes, I do have a good example for you on that. We have an activity that focuses on girls ages 10 to 18, specifically trying to keep their education going and keeping them in school. So it's an accelerated learning program. So we focus on making sure that they have the age appropriate skills that they need if they want to transition back into public school at some point. But we are collaborating with our health colleagues and with our agriculture colleagues that oversee the WASH program, which is water and sanitation and health. And so in these accelerated learning centers where we focus, they're very community-based and community-oriented because we really are trying to focus on just girls and a community support for girls being in school. So there are mentors empowered and trained to support girls and provide community messaging. Girls are taught hygiene and reproductive health. They're taught some family planning kind of lessons. There are girl-friendly latrines that are built. And then there are also messages for the wider community against female genital mutilation and gender-based violence issues. And all of that actually really came into play when COVID-19 struck, because it allowed, there was a platform already in place to take the hygiene practices that you need for COVID-19, just step it up a little bit. So all of the platforms, the mechanisms were put in place to push out that messaging to the community. One of the things, because I went to meet with the partner that implements this program today, and one of the things that kind of happened as we saw, it's very easy to tip to the other side of things, is the community said, okay, fine, we've let you talk us into sending the girls to school, but boys need to be educated too. And in a place like Mali, where there's no education for anybody, we had to relent. So in several of the communities, we said, okay, fine, we can have 5 boys. So 5 boys in any accelerated learning center can come into the program as well. So that's how we've tried to create some equity balance, if you will. But yes, Rebecca, we do have an example where we try to collaborate with our other technical sectors and address some of the challenges that we see in education. So thanks for that question.
Great, Chriselle, and thank you for that response. That was so thoughtful and thorough. Well, it's almost 7 o'clock. I know it's very late in Mali where Chriselle is. It's earlier in Arizona where Yvette is. But for those of us in DC, it's almost dinner time. So I just want to thank our panelists so much for joining us this evening and kicking off our ITAP events here for International Education Week. And a huge thank you to the audience for joining us and to our ITAP graduate assistants again who have helped us. So please be in touch. And what can I say? Stay healthy and stay safe, right? All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you so much.